Hi, there's a lot of conversation about coaching these days, and I think coaching is very important. But the real trick is to know which coaching is needed and when. Now you may say, but Phil, isn't coaching coaching? And the answer is yes, it is, but there's different kinds of coaching. So I would like to share with you the way I think about it. And typically for everything that I'm doing, I always try to have a model that I work to, so I have a basis to work from, and then an application. So I'll be sharing that with you. And the model I'd like to share with you is what's called the nudge spectrum. Now, the nudge spectrum is definitely a spectrum. It kind of goes from one side over to the other. There's no real clear, distinct points along it. They bleed in, and that's important because I'm going to give you 4 distinct ways to look at coaching so you can decide which coaching approach should I take. And I'm going to say, well, they have 4. But when you get into the situation, they're not as clearly defined as that. They kind of bleed, and that's why I call them a spectrum. The first one at the far left-hand end is what I call the nudge, and in fact we call this the nudge spectrum. The nudge is really cool. The nudge is when you're dealing typically with a really high potential person or someone that you've had a lot of relationship with over the years who's got a high get-it factor, and you don't need to do a particularly extensive coaching session. It's just a matter of saying to them, for example, now remember, when you deliver this particular presentation, the gentleman that you will be speaking to never wants to spend more than a couple seconds at a time on any given point. So don't belabor the points, just get through them. And the person you're talking to says, great, very helpful, thanks a lot. Take a couple of seconds per point and move on. He has a high get-it factor. So the nudge is just a gentle little nudge. Or you might want to say something, for example, now on this particular sales call, these folks are not too formal, so I know we're coming off another previous sales call, but you might want to just take your tie and jacket off before we go in to kind of fit in with their world a little bit. The person says, great, big, that's a good help, thanks very much. So the nudge is just a little gentle coach. It's almost imperceptible. It's a bit of advice, but the person that you give it to has a high get-it factor. The next step on the spectrum is what I call true coaching. And this is typically 2 to 3 minutes where you share, as the coach, your thinking in a particular issue. So you say, okay, here's what I would do in this situation, or here's what I saw you do, you might want to think about this. And typically in this scenario, there's not a lot of discussion required. There's not a lot of back and forth. There's not going to be a lot of debate. It's more a matter of, okay, Phil, that was very helpful. Thanks very much. So for example, if I were in a sales call and with this other individual, and when I come out of the sales call, I might give them a little bit of coaching that talks about the fact that they had prepared quite well before the call, but they failed to use the preparation that they did in the call in order to move it ahead a bit. And the person goes, oh, you're right, I should have done that, that was very helpful, thank you. So in this case, you might take 3 or 4 minutes, give a little context, and share with them your thinking so that the other person says, got it, duly noted, and typically they'll make a little note somewhere so they can remember it for next time. So it's pretty one way, you to them, but it happens just over 4 to 5 minutes. And I tend to use this often between meetings, so if I'm going from one meeting to another, or perhaps if we're in a situation where we're just coming out of a meeting and we're all going to go our separate ways, but I want to share a thought in the moment, I use that technique. The third is really a discussion form of coaching, and this one is much longer, often 30 minutes. And here's where you would ask the person, how did you approach this particular issue? Why did you approach it that way? What were you thinking? Did you have some other thoughts in mind? Great, let me give you my thoughts on your thoughts. Let's talk about it so that at the end, you feel comfortable going into the next similar situation with perhaps a different approach or a better approach. Now, we often think of coaching as being critical. This wasn't good, you should do it better. But very often, coaching can be, that was great, do it again. So that can be in the nudge situation, that could be in my 2 to 3 minutes. You did a great job there when you met with that individual, you were really good, you understood where she was coming from and you met her needs perfectly. That was great, you really spoke to the issue she was concerned about. Or even in the discussion where you're doing a post-mortem. The individual you're coaching might have done a great job and you want to break down why it was such a great job for them so that in discussion, the person you're coaching says, okay, I get it, I could replicate that next time. That was helpful. You were a bit of a mirror to me. So this idea of deciding what the right approach to coach is very important. But don't always think of coaching as being to correct. It can also be to compliment or to reinforce. And then at the far end of the spectrum is discipline. And this is where you have coached, you've talked, you've shared, you've actually made it clear that the individual is not taking the right approach. And in your organization, the approach the individual is taking is unacceptable. It must change. It could be on any issue. It could be something around government regulations or some form of legislation or some issue, something to do with a union contract. And in your judgment, the individual is approaching it wrongly, and it must stop. And in fact, you are going to indicate that if they don't stop, it will become a discipline issue and move into a much more severe situation. So this idea of the spectrum allows you to go everywhere from a gentle nudge all the way through to a discipline situation. And that's why we call it the nudge spectrum. So that's the model. Let me just give you 3 quick points on application. The first is, before you even begin to provide some coaching, do a quick mental check. What I do, I quickly say, okay, where on the spectrum am I? If it's on the discipline side, you're well prepared and you know that usually. But am I at the nudge, the coaching, or the discussion? What would be the right approach? The second thing is, then prepare accordingly. Remember, you don't have a lot of time, and people tend to only remember about 10% of what you say. So make sure that you're prepared, being mindful of where you have chosen to be on the spectrum. So if you have chosen it to be a nudge, and you take the opportunity to nudge, that's not a 15-minute discussion. Remember, you've chosen to nudge, make it a nudge. If you've chosen to have a discussion, make sure you set aside the time, you book it, you book a place free from distractions, and you have that discussion. So prepare yourself based on where you've put them on the spectrum. And then thirdly, I would say once you begin the coaching, things don't always end up the way we think they're going to as leaders. So the individual's response may shift you on that spectrum from what you intended to. So you just need to be mindful of that and be aware of it. And if you feel it's moving further away from the nudge coaching, more towards the discussion side, you might want to say, okay, I hadn't realized that this would go as far into this, as deep as it's going. So if you don't mind, let's reschedule it so I can give you my full attention. So being mindful of the fact that you were there to help them, pick the right point on the spectrum, be prepared, and also be aware that it might migrate after you get into the discussion. And that, I think, is the best way to determine how best to coach and where in the spectrum to put yourself.